Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to make a little video to explain to you why I do flood my cookie slabs with epoxy resin. And I thought I'd do this video because a couple of you left comments on multiple of the different cookie slab coffee table videos asking, hey Javier, why do you always put epoxy on the entire surface of your cookie slab? In fact, one reader asked a bunch of questions on how to approach when doing the cookie slab and everything. And so we had a long conversation in one of the videos where we went back and forth, and he also shared pictures of his slab and how it turned out. And at the end, it was beautiful. As you see here on this picture, it turned out really nice. And it made me happy because I like it when I see that like the videos that I do have some kind of impact on others, because I learned everything I know from YouTube, so from you all. And so for me, being able to give something back and help others is just very satisfying. That is the reason why I do these videos. And so that's kind of fun. If you do these kind of things, if you use anything you learn from my channel, please share your pictures of what you did. That makes me always happy. But I thought I'd make a video because apparently there's some questions about that, and I know that it's maybe a weird technique that not everyone uses. So I'm going to explain to you why I use it, why I like it. It's obviously up to you to decide if that makes sense or not. And so we have here a cookie slab, typical, so cookie slab means that you take the tree and you chop it like that. Okay, so it's an end grain slab, which means we are looking on the top, on the growth direction. Basically, we are looking into the tree. That is why it has like these round shapes, and you see the ear rings and everything. And that is the opposite to when you cut a tree like that, which are typically the slabs that you then have where you make, for instance, a table. That is a big difference. Okay, the wood will react completely different if you cut it like that and you have end grain, or if you cut it the other way and you don't have end grain. That has impact on how you have to treat and how you have to work with the wood. And then it has a huge impact on how you can treat it and coat it. If you ever worked with a cookie slab, you might have noticed that it's what I call thirsty. So when you put your coat on the wood, it soaks it in. And that is because of how wood is made of, right? And I'm going to explain that to you using my favorite food, spaghetti. So when a tree grows, it grows from the bottom to the top, obviously. And that means these wood fibers grow like that, okay? So you have the tree growing, and it also becomes bigger, and it adds those fibers, and it's in that direction, okay? So it's like that. Take it like that, okay? So if you cut now a tree like this, right? Like you typically do when you have the slabs that you work with to make a table, then the spaghetti is laid also flat, right? You have all these fibers laying here, and then you sand it, you make it really flat, and then you put your coating on it. And what it does, it's like the coating gets soaked in only a little bit, because all these spaghettis, all these fibers are very flat next to each other, right? And they close, they're very compact, and there's very little room where the coating can actually go and be soaked in. Now, if you cut your tree like this, and you have an end grain slab, then it is like that, and you are cutting here and sanding and everything. But between those fibers, between the spaghettis, you have those holes because they're round. And in between, you have holes. And so when you now put your coating on it, it will get soaked in through these holes really deep into the slab. Right, into the wood. This fact has like a couple of side effects or problems, if you want to call it that way. It's like, first you need more coating because it gets soaked in and soaked in and soaked in a lot, right? But then the other problem is that when you drop liquids on it, like if you didn't coat it with, I don't know, polyurethane that seals it completely, if you used oil or Rubio monocoat or another similar coating, then when you drop liquid on it, maybe a glass of wine, you're having a glass of wine and then some wine spills on it, right? And you cannot remove it immediately because you didn't see it. It gets soaked in. Gets soaked in because there is still that effect that like the fibers are like that and you have these holes in between. The coating can actually not really seal it and close it off, and so it gets soaked in and you cannot remove it, and you have to sand it, and you sometimes have to sand it like a lot because it's a deep stain. And so that is exactly the reason why I use epoxy resin on my cookie slabs. What I do is once I cut it and it's flat and it's nice, and do a little sanding, 80 grit, not crazy, but make sure it's flat, it doesn't have any holes in it and things I don't want. Then I take a little bit of epoxy resin and I just flood it over the entire slab. And what happens is that the end grain soaks in this epoxy resin, right? You will see it if you flood it. You will see how it gets soaked in. So you flood a little bit more. Ideally, you have a little layer of epoxy resin over your entire slab. And then when it's dry, what the epoxy resin did is it soaked into those spaghettis, right? It soaked into those holes here, and then it dried and it closed all those pores that are normally soaking in the coating, right? So you seal this off, you let it dry, and then you sand it away, because I don't like epoxy resin surface on my slab. I want the wood, right? So I sand this away, not too much, just like the surface, so you make sure you can feel still the wood, right? Because if you start sanding like crazy, right, you will remove all the layers and all the epoxy, and then you're back at the beginning. But if you sand it lightly to make sure you feel the wood, but like in these pores there's still the epoxy resin that is cured, then afterwards you can coat it as you do a normal table, and continue like with the rest of the table until it's finished. And then afterwards you have the advantage that the liquids don't get soaked in that much, and it's also easier to coat, because one of the problems that you have when you want to coat an end-grade slab and it's not cured with epoxy resin is that it soaks in the oil really quickly. And so you see that in this project where I made the Sequoia table, when I put oil on the lower side of the end, because normally I use linseed oil on the bottom side of the table, because nobody sees that, but I don't want it to be untreated. That doesn't look nice, so I use linseed oil, which is cheap. And so I tried to do that, and it soaked it in immediately, so you had all these stains, right? And it was so difficult to actually get an equal look, a nice looking coat. Like it didn't even succeed with that. And so that doesn't happen if you have epoxy resin on your slab. Then you can treat it and it's looking really nice. I'm going to show to you the effect using this slab here, right? So this slab, I just treated it like I said, like made it flat. I sanded it with 80 grit paper, right? And so what I did is on one side I put epoxy resin and let it cure, and you see here how I'm distributing the epoxy resin, making sure it's evenly distributed over the slab. On the other end, I don't do anything. Once this slab was dried, I came back and I sanded it. And so, as I mentioned to you, light sanding, you see here on the slab how the epoxy resin soaked in, right? You see in some places it's really shiny. That's where there was enough epoxy resin. In other places it's soaked in, and so it becomes like a little bit rough, even to touch. So I sanded all of that away to make sure it's even. And you see that the epoxy has a small effect also on how the wood looks, right? So on the outer ends, I didn't actually flood it until there, and so there you see the original look, and then the one with the epoxy, right? But it's sanded, so you feel the wood now, but because there is like all these pores have been soaked in with epoxy resin, that changes the look. So now I take linseed oil, and I'm taking here first on the untreated side, I'm taking 2 milliliters of linseed oil, and I put it on and I try to rub it. And now you see that it has almost no effect. It's very difficult for me to distribute. There where I put the drops, it soaks in immediately, so you have a stain. And on the other ends, you see on the other sides, you see that it's much lighter. And that's because it didn't have that much oil to soak in. Now normally I would obviously now use a lot of oil to make sure you don't see these stains, but the point here is that you see what the effect is of this end grain and how it soaks it in, right? Now I take on the other side the same amount of linseed oil, 2 milliliters, and I distribute it, and now you see when I rub it in how it gets distributed over that entire wood, and it doesn't get just soaked in on this place where I put it in. And so obviously I use less coating, but also I get like a nicer look because it doesn't have like the problem that it soaks it in one piece and on the other one I don't have enough. This effect obviously happens only with liquid coatings, right? So Rubio or oil or other types of liquids, right? If you use other things to treat your wood, for instance, wax or something like that, then the effects are different. I have to say I don't have a lot of experience using these kind of coatings, so it's not really my favorites, and so I don't know how it works. So that's basically the difference, right? And you see that here, so I have it here. This has now been drying for about a week or something like that, right? And so you see here the effect of the same amount of linseed oil and how it looks, and here that amount of linseed oil, I was only able to use it on this area here, so there's a lot left, but also you see here and here the stains where I dropped the oil onto, right? Now you can imagine, I mean, that is not a big deal, right? Because you can just take a lot of oil and make sure you don't see these stains anymore, but you can imagine what happens when you spill some wine on it, right? Because these pores are still open. Even so, if you put the oil on it, they're still open, right? And so when you drop your wine on it, it just gets soaked in and you have those stains, right? And that doesn't happen here. When you put wine here, that won't happen. So it's really a completely different way of treating your end grain slabs. That's it. That is the reason why I flood my end grain slabs with epoxy resin. I hope you like this little video, you'll find this useful. If you feel that this doesn't make sense and you have another solution for your end grain slabs that you prefer, please leave it in the comments, because I'm always curious to learn about new techniques, new things, right? There's always so many things to learn. And so we can have a discussion. If you do any end grain slabs yourself and you use this technique or not, like leave some pictures also in the comments. I always like to see other projects. That's it. If you like this little video, then please thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I wish you happy holidays. See you around.